Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Norman, and thank you very much for inviting me to your conference. Today, I will elaborate somewhat how people and companies and countries behave when they have a crisis during a crisis. I will present two case studies, and I will end up with what I think will be the long-lasting effects of the corona or COVID-19 pandemic. My professional career started in the late 80s. I've been in the financial sector for 35 years. I worked in the late 80s at the Central Bank of Sweden, the Riksbank. Suddenly, one of the top executives came to me and said, Peter, we have a crisis. The guy who is handling or responsible for managing the forex reserves has resigned and he has gone to the private sector. So we need someone who can take his place. And I said, of course, I will do that. And then I was there for a number of years. And then in the late 90s, from out of the blue, one of the ministers in the government called me and said, Peter, we have a crisis. There's a public pension fund starting up and there's a complete turmoil and lack of leadership and management. Can you help us out? And I said, of course I will do that. Then I spent my next 10 years in that particular position in the public pension fund. And then once again, out of the blue, the Prime Minister of Sweden called me and summoned me to his office. And I had no idea what it was about. Then he told me, Peter, I think I have a problem or almost a crisis. We have a Minister for Financial Markets who will not be with us anymore. And now, since we have a turmoil in the financial markets, as you know, there's a need of a new senior position on that level. Could you take that position and be a member of my cabinet? I had no political experience whatsoever, but of course, when a prime minister asks you, you say, yes, of course, I will do that. And that has always been a line in my career. When there is a crisis, I will be there. I hope the causality talks in my favor. That is, when there is a crisis, I will come there and try to solve it, not the other way around, that when I go, there will be a crisis. Now I will go to the first of my two case studies. Not yet, but soon. First of all, I will tell you something about an Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter, he created the expression creative destruction. And I think that is very valid for the time we're living in right now. It's very valid when there's a crisis in a personal life or in a company or in a country. Rightly managed, a crisis, a destruction, if that is rightly managed, when you come out on the other side, you can be very prosperous and you can make new things and make it very much better. That's what it really meant with creative destruction, and I will come back to that. The best comparison we have with COVID-19, I think, is the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was at its peak in 1918 to 1921. One difference between the Spanish flu and the COVID-19 is when the Spanish flu was aggressive, almost everybody who died was young people. They were younger than 45 years of age. On the contrary, what we see today with the COVID-19. Almost 5% is estimated of the population on the earth died in the Spanish flu. If you compare that with the population as of today, it should be 300 million people dying from the COVID-19. As of today, we have roughly 1 million people dying, so there is much more to come if we should have comparison with the Spanish flu. In economic terms, countries behaved differently and was affected differently. For instance, in Sweden, it took 10 years to go back to the GDP levels as we had before the Spanish flu. In the US, it took 4 years. And now to my first of my two case studies. I will go back almost 40 years to September 1981. Suddenly, in September, a Soviet submarine goes aground in the Swedish archipelago. It goes on the rocks. The submarine tries to get off the ground itself, but it fails, and it's in the middle of the night. In the morning, After a couple of hours, the Swedish military forces recognize the Soviet submarine, and Sweden also finds out that the submarine is armed with nuclear devices. We have a big crisis towards the Soviet Union. And after some fruitless negotiations between Soviet and Sweden how to do with the submarine, Soviet sends two heavily armed marine vessels towards Swedish border in order to free the submarine with force if necessary. When the vessel is closing on to the Swedish border at sea, the generals in the Swedish military headquarters became, what should we say, nervous or confused. Sweden had not been at war since 1814. Now it's more than 200 years ago. The generals were, as I told you, confused and nervous, so they called the Swedish Prime Minister for advice. The Swedish Prime Minister at that time was a man in his late 50s. He represented the Farmers' political party. He was known as a phlegmatic person. He talked slowly. He always waited in a couple of seconds before he answered a question. Some people would say he was a person you can make fun of. All this was of course known to the Swedish generals, but nevertheless they called the Prime Minister for advice. And the generals had really no hope that the Prime Minister would help them out in any way. When the Prime Minister heard the story from the generals, he promptly answered, "Keep the border, don't let them cross the border," and then he hanged up the telephone. The generals were almost in shock, but they at once ordered that the Swedish Marine to direct a laser beam towards the Soviet vessels. And when the Soviets realized that the Swedes would not accept the vessels without a fight, they went home to the bases, the home bases in Kaliningrad. And this is an example where a person surprises everyone with an ability to act when it was mostly needed, and where nobody thought that he was able to. The second case studies I want to share with you is 30 years ago almost. In the fall of 1982, there were storms in financial markets. The European System for Fixed Exchange Rate Regimes, EMS, European Monetary System, was under attack from a number of hedge funds and other financial players, including George Soros. The Finnish marka, this Finnish currency, collapsed in the beginning of September, and the 16th of September, the British pound sterling collapsed as well. In Sweden, there was a political unity to defend the fixed exchange rate regime almost by any means. And to defend an exchange rate regimes, you raise the interest rate. So, the 16th of September 1992, the Central Bank of Sweden, the Riksbank, raised the rate to 500%. 500%. During this moment, I worked in a Swedish investment bank in Stockholm. And this was the most hectic day that you can imagine. No deals at that time were made electronically. Every deals were made manually over the phone. Rightly managed, our firm could make a fortune, but it was hard work and nothing was allowed to go wrong. All of us worked extremely hard, long days sitting with at least 2 telephones at the same time. At that time, we had a very charismatic deputy CEO at the firm. We all were very pleased to have him as a captain on the ship when the markets was in complete turmoil. When the central bank hiked the rate of 500%, he went home. He went home. And he entered the office again after roughly 1 week when the crisis was almost over. He couldn't stand the stress that was put on to him and the firm. By the way, the firm did well and we could take advantage of the situation and we made a fortune. But the sense morale is, again, the one you expected to really stand tall failed, and the previous example, the opposite around. And that's really my message. In different crisis situations, it is almost impossible to know which person that will prevail and which person that will fail. And what more can we learn? Well, one wisdom, and that is general, is to put your eggs in more than one basket, of course. And that's a financial truth. And do have a mental preparation that things and people will not act and develop that the way you have anticipated. And also have a mental preparation that crisis will come also in the future. Be sure that the COVID-19 is not the last crisis that we will handle in the future. And that crisis is an opportunity to make good business if you are prepared, if you go back to Schumpeter's creative destruction. In Sweden, that is particularly emphasized. For instance, in the 50s, the clothing industry was completely destroyed in Sweden. People or firms in Asia did clothing much cheaper than we did, and we had a lot of unemployment. In the 70s, for instance, the shipbuilding industry in Sweden collapsed. People on firms in Asia created ships much cheaper than we did. We had a lot of unemployment, but we managed to transfer the economy in such a way that we now have a more diversified enterprise than we have in the past, and that is much better. We have more basket for our eggs. I will finish to discuss what I think will be the lasting effects of COVID-19. First of all, price will fall on commercial real estate. What firms will know, and they already has known that, is that they don't need the big premises anymore. People like and can work at home. Not all the time. They might be in the working space for once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, but they don't have to be there all the time. They prefer to be at home. They prefer not to commute, for instance, and so on. And that leads to that they can shrink the office space, and that will lead to pressure on prices on commercial real estate. We have already seen that, but I think that's only the beginning. We will see less traveling and more work from home. We will see a pickup in traveling compared to today's level, but we will not go back where we were. I think more bold decision is to come to fight climate change. There is going to be big public investments to restart the economy, and those investments will be linked to the climate change in another way than we have seen in the past. More discipline on state budgets. I think every country in the world realized that when a new crisis will come, and as I told you, it will, then you have to have your state budget in order. Otherwise, you will be yourself in great turmoil. For instance, I think Greece and Italy are very pleased that they are in the Eurozone right now, because if they have not been there, they have been almost banished from the earth. I think we will see less outsourcing. I think firms would like to have more control over the processes. That means less transportation, maybe more delivery companies closer to the home base, and maybe more production in your home country to control your processes more than you have done in the past. Maybe less outsourcing to China, for instance. It is hard to change the behavior of people. For instance, in Sweden, a number of years ago, we had an alarm from potato crisps. In potato crisps boxes, there was some material added that could create cancer in your body. When this news exploded, the consumptions, the demand for potato crisp came almost to zero. But after 1 month, almost, the consumption was as it was in the past. It's hard to change people's behavior, but I think this pandemic is of that great extent, so it will, and I think this will be at least some of the lasting effects. So that was my concluding remarks. I hope you have a wonderful conference, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you.